Well, now in Archive on 4, Isabel Hilton reflects on the journeys these displaced Tibetans have taken over the last 50 years and asks what their future holds. A Tibetan Odyssey, 50 years in exile.
A Tibetan demonstration in London on the 10th of March 2008 calls for a free Tibet. This year will mark the 50th anniversary of the uprising in Lhasa in 1959 against the Chinese occupation of Tibet, which began 10 years earlier. This is the moment when the crowds welcomed Tibet's spiritual leader, the Dalai Lama, as he arrived in exile in India in April 1959, following the uprising.
In a person's life, I think 50 years is a very long time. But for a struggle, maybe 50 years is a long time and maybe not. It's time to look back, evaluate what has happened, what has not happened. Our strength, of course, one is His Holiness leadership. Our strength is determination of the Tibetan people inside Tibet. Our strength is also the non-violent nature of our struggle.
In this programme, we'll be talking about the experience of the last half-century to Tibetan refugees in India, to members of the exile government, and to His Holiness the Dalai Lama.
Things are still going on very badly inside Tibet. That, unfortunately, after 50 years, still basically is the same way, and in some cases even worse.
As the convoy came into sight, here where the foothills of the Himalayas meet the plain of Assam. Correspondents and cameramen of the world's press and radio watched as the convoys dashed in and surged forward for close-ups of a young man in the robe of a monk, the Dalai Lama.
At the time, little was known about Tibet in the West, and even less about its 24-year-old spiritual and political leader. The Dalai Lama's sudden arrival in India caused an international sensation.
He turned the greeting of the Buddhists as they shouted praise for their God King, and when a photographer shouted thank you, he answered in English, pleasure.
Chinese troops had occupied Tibet since 1950, and reporters clamoured to know about the events that had forced the Dalai Lama to flee.
A translation of the statement made by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. The relation of Tibetans with China became openly strained from the early part of February 1959. The Dalai Lama had agreed a month in advance to attend a cultural show in the Chinese headquarters, and the date was suddenly fixed for the 10th of March. The people of Lhasa became apprehensive that some harm might be done to the Dalai Lama, and as a result, about 10,000 people gathered around the Dalai Lama's summer palace, Nobulinga, and physically prevented the Dalai Lama from attending the function. Reinforcements arrived to strengthen the Chinese garrisons in Lhasa and Tibet. On the 17th March, 2 or 3 mortar shells were fired in the direction of the Nobulinga palace. Fortunately, the shells fell in a nearby pond. After this, it became imperative for the Dalai Lama, the members of his family, and his high officials to leave Lhasa.
My name is Losang Tenzin, and people know me as Samdong Rinpoche. I'm a Buddhist monk, and at this moment working as the elected political leader for the Tibetans in exile. We escaped from monastery in year 1959 and just follow His Holiness and take shuttle in India. And His Holiness left in the night of the 17th. Midnight of 20th and 21st March, the bombardment started. And we escaped from monastery at the evening of 21st. And we entered in India around the second week of April.
Tejpur, 18th April 1959. It has always been accepted that the Tibetan people are different from the Han people of China. Throughout history, Tibet remained autonomous in control of its internal affairs. In 1951, under pressure of the Chinese government, a 17-point agreement was made between China and Tibet. It was agreed that there would be no interference by the Chinese government with the Tibetan religion and customs and her internal administration. The Dalai Lama and his government tried their best to adhere to this agreement, but the Chinese armed forces destroyed a large number of monasteries, many lamas were killed, and the interference in the exercise of religious freedom increased. And all that the Dalai Lama wishes to say at the moment is to express his sincere regret at the tragedy which has overtaken Tibet. The Dalai Lama is extremely grateful to the people and government of India for their spontaneous and generous welcome, as well as the asylum granted to him and his followers.
India rose to the emergency that the sudden arrival of tens of thousands of traumatized Tibetans presented. For the refugees, everything from the unfamiliar climate to the low altitude came as a shock. They travelled hundreds of miles in the harshest of conditions. They'd been forced to make a dizzying leap from an isolated feudal society to the brutal realities of mid-20th century exile. Few were prepared for the tragedy that had befallen them. They didn't know how long they'd stay, nor what would happen to their homeland. The plight of the Tibetans aroused strong emotions in India, with its long history of contact and trade with Tibet and powerful religious sympathy.
Tibet, as I told you, affects some deeper chords in our hearts. Tibet, culturally speaking, is an offshoot of India. That is to say, of Buddhism, not of India politically. And we may be Hindus, we may be anything in India, but Buddha is the greatest Indian that ever lived.
For India's Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, the situation created conflict between his desire for good relations with China and India's spiritual connection to Tibet.
Such interference doesn't produce any desirable results, even from the point of view of the person who wants to interfere. The result aimed at is just ill will and anger. So that has been our basic policy, conditioned always, of course, by guarding, protecting the interests of India and the larger causes that we hold dear.
Charles Wheeler, then the South Asia correspondent of the BBC, reported the issue at the time.
You running? Some Indians would be happier if the Dalai Lama in due course were to leave India altogether. And in this connection there's been talk here of a personal appeal to the United Nations. But here I think Mr. Nehru again would object. To take the Tibetan issue to New York might be to brand China as an aggressor, might make still more difficult than it is already China's admission to the United Nations, and might be of very little practical benefit to the Tibetans themselves. So that on balance, and at the moment, it seems more likely that Mr. Nehru will use the opportunity of the Dalai Lama's presence here in India to offer mediation to the Chinese and to try to do something to help the Tibetans by secret diplomacy.
For 50 years, India's played host to the Tibetan government in exile, established by the Dalai Lama to manage the affairs of what were to be more than 100,000 Tibetan refugees. It's not always an easy relationship, and it was to create tensions between India and its giant neighbour. Bembi Tsering, the recently elected Speaker of the Tibetan government in exile.
Historically, we have played as the buffer between India and China. India never had any boundary with China in the last 2,000 years, except for the last 50 years. And they never had any war with each other also. Only after Chinese invaded Tibet, they had the first war in 1962. One of the basic distrust between India and China is also because of Tibet, and it's also because His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan refugees live in India. So that wound has not healed in Indian mind.
In September 1959, 6 months after his arrival in India, the Dalai Lama spoke to Charles Wheeler.
What's your reaction to Mr. Nehru's rather bold refusal to bring up Tibet?
From Mr. Nehru,
I'm grateful for Mr. Nehru's kindness and practical wise, but I must confess that the attitude of government of India has been disappointing, although I fully appreciate their difficult position in this matter.
According to your information, what do you think China is doing in Tibet at the present time?
It is clear that the real objective of the Chinese government is the extermination of the Tibetan nationality, the total annihilation of Tibetan religion and culture. Peace-loving men and women of the world, I have no doubt that with your sympathy and support, truth and justice will ultimately prevail, and the life of freedom and religious devotion will be restored to my people.
We asked the Dalai Lama in Dharamsala to reflect on that filmed interview.
Today when I saw picture of myself at that young age, so looks like baby. So now after 50 years, the Tibetan refugee community in this country, in the field of education and also resettlement, and then also all different kind of work for preservation of Tibetan culture and Buddhist study. Now, quite successful, quite satisfactorily. All these is due to government of India's support, India's help. Meanwhile, so as at that time is mentioned, the things are still going on very badly inside Tibet. That, unfortunately, after 50 years, still basically the same way, and in some cases even worse. At that time, simply suppression of some kind of revolt. But now, not only that, the systematic destruction of Tibetan spirit, Tibetan culture, Tibetan Buddhism.